And hello, everyone. Hello, trackers who are watching us. As you know, my name is Anna, and I work for Climate Tracker. And today we have here with us a very special guest that maybe you know already, but maybe if you are new in this campaign, maybe not. Our super friend, Jesse Bragg, who is the Media Director of Corporate Accountability International. Thanks for being here, Jesse.
Thanks for having me back. What is this, my third time on with you guys? It's always great. So.
Yeah, we are always loving to work with you all because we always bring really interesting topics. So we are really excited today, trackers, because we have kind of an exclusive. Like, this report was released yesterday, and it's really, really interesting. I'm sure you will all love it, but I will let Jesse speak about it. First of all, I just want to remind you that you can engage in this webinar. So as you know, you are seeing us through a thing called YouTube Live. And next to the channel, there's a place where you can comment, and I will be there replying to your questions. So if you send a question there for Jesse, at the end of this webinar, I will ask of him, which is great. And also, if you can't find this for some reason, you can always post it on the Facebook event or something like this. So we will try to reply to your questions at the end of all this. But yeah, let's jump into it. So Jesse, I want to know everything about this report that you released, which is called Inside Job, Big Polluters Lobbyist on the Inside at the UNFCCC. What can you tell about this report?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say. This report was in many ways a reaction to some of the comments that we heard from delegations at the UNFCCC who were opposed to developing a policy to address conflicts of interest. Those delegations include the US, Australia, the European Union, and Brazil in particular, who said things like, we have no idea if a conflict of interest even exists in this space or what it would look like. And so what we tried to do with this report is show them, give them the evidence that we've known for some time, that there are numerous business industry NGOs operating at the UN Climate Treaty that also at home, in the US, Australia, EU, in the same countries that are opposing this policy, these bingo groups have undermined climate action. And I think one of the good examples is the US Chamber of Commerce. Many probably are vaguely familiar with the US Chamber of Commerce. If you're not from the US, maybe you don't have as good an understanding of what they do, but some of their biggest funders are fossil fuel corporations like ExxonMobil, like Chevron, and a lot of the US coal industry. And so what they do in the US is try to find ways, especially now with the Trump administration, to hold back climate policy, to undermine efforts by environmentalists to advance sound climate policy. And they've been attacking the Clean Power Plan, which is the US's, the central piece of the US's commitment to the Paris Agreement. So the question we're basically posing with this report is, how can we allow groups that are trying to stop climate action at home to be part of the negotiations at the UN? It simply does not make sense, and we need to take action to stop it.
Awesome. So you gave us a great example of one of those bad guys. Do you have a general idea of how do they work in the UNFCCC? Like, do they kind of influence the governments? Do they have their own strategies and meet with people? Or maybe you want to even explain some of the other groups that you analyzed.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges here is finding out where those conversations happen. We know that groups like the US Chamber of Commerce, World Coal Association, Business Europe, and many, many others. There's actually over 270 business industry NGOs accredited to the UNFCCC. So we know they're there. And as you might imagine, they don't really want people to know what they're talking about when they talk with delegates, but they're there. And what we're doing with this report is it helps us illustrate potentially what those conversations are like. We know how they feel about climate action because of how they're acting at the national level. And so we can only extrapolate what those conversations look like at the UN. But certainly it's hard to imagine that at home, the US Chamber of Commerce, for example, or the Business Council of Australia, in undermining climate policy, and then at the international level, they're the biggest champions for climate policy. It doesn't make sense. The likely truth is that they're echoing the same things that they say at home. So to give you a little bit of a walkthrough of the other groups that we looked at, and again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Like I said, there are over 270 groups. Not all of them represent the fossil fuel industry, but certainly many of them do. So we have the National Mining Association, which is a US-based organization. It represents Peabody Energy, Arch Coal, GE Mining, and the American Coal Council. I don't think anyone that you talk to involved in the UN talks who really knows climate science and climate policy would say that coal has a place in the solution. Yet the National Mining Association is accredited to those talks. We also have Business Roundtable, which represents the CEOs of every major multinational corporation. So you have Shell, Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Duke Energy, Phillips, Marathon Oil, Marathon Petroleum Company, and Peabody Energy, to name a few. And they've done things like lobbying to open up protected lands in the US to drilling, mining, and fracking. They've also attacked the Clean Power Plan or opposed it, and have supported the expansion of oil pipelines in the United States. In Europe, we take a look at Fuels Europe, whose members include BP, ExxonMobil, Shell, Total, Luke Oil, and Vero Energy. Fuels Europe is the European Refiners Association. So they've opposed European Union emissions trading schemes, and which is already a very conservative market-based approach. And they couldn't even get on board with that. And they've opposed greenhouse gas targets in Europe. And then perhaps most alarmingly, they've said things like that the EU is already doing enough, that the EU to do more around cutting its emissions or stepping up to support climate action would be irrelevant in the global balance, which completely ignores the EU's historical responsibility to this crisis. Developed countries are disproportionately responsible, as we all know, for the greenhouse gas emissions and therefore climate change. And so the idea that just by cutting their emissions, the amount they have, they're doing enough, misses decades of emissions. And then we have, hopping down to Australia, the Business Council of Australia, whose members include BHP Billiton, BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Shell, and Rio Tinto. The Business Council of Australia's president is also on BHP Billiton's board. It's opposed Australia's carbon tax, and its members that it represents are the ones really fighting to advance the Great Australian Bight drilling plans. And then finally, we have the International Chamber of Commerce, which we kind of call the corporate door opener. While they don't take very active positions for or against climate policy, their role is to make sure that the groups I just mentioned have access. They believe that the more access and influence businesses have, the better. And so what that means is that with the International Chamber of Commerce, they are the group that's ensuring that some of the dirtiest and most destructive corporations and the groups that represent them have access to the climate negotiations. And so therefore, in many ways, their role is just as destructive as those that are actively undermining climate policy. So that's a quick rundown. I talked a little bit about the US Chamber of Commerce in the beginning, so I won't run through that again. But those are the 6 that our report looked at.
Thank you, Jesse. And I think pretty international. I think the devil is everywhere in this report. You have Australia and the EU and the United States. So I was thinking the Bonn Intersessional will begin in less than a week. And it's known because some very important events will happen related to that. So we will be discussing about the importance of conflict of interest or not, or we will see that it's not important, we will see. So how do you think all these that you explain, all this influence affects effectively the climate change negotiations? And also what needs to be done, what will happen in Bonn this May?
Sure. I think it's a little known secret, or it's a widely known secret, that most of the influence that these groups have and that these corporations have happens at home. You know, the US delegation comes here with its marching orders, especially now under the Trump administration, to represent the interests of the fossil fuel industry. But what this does is it lends a lot of credibility to these organizations. The UNFCCC is one of the last hopes for addressing climate change in a global way, a way that can actually provide solutions and catalyze an aggressive transition to renewables. So we cannot continue to allow those that are driving this crisis to have access to it. Certainly they have influence when they arrive, but this is just this conflict of interest policy is just the first step in a campaign to reduce the influence of the fossil fuel industry around the world. So what this could look like in Bonn is really, as we know, these international negotiations are hard to predict. The one thing we can predict is that things move slowly, but the workshop that will be on Tuesday is will address a range of issues related to observer participation, non-party stakeholders and their role in how to in their engagement with the process. One of the guiding questions is related to how to best address conflicts of interest, how to prevent conflicts of interest in this space. And we also know that at least one proponent of a strong conflict of interest policy, the lead delegate from Ecuador, Walter Schult, will be on this panel. And he's on this panel because of his delegation's interest in advancing a strong conflict of interest policy. So it's hard to predict what will happen in this discussion. These open-ended workshops are you know, they're not structured for a reason, but it could range from a discussion that has a set of outcomes that then the contact group for the subsidiary body and implementation will then take up and discuss and arrive at some conclusions. It could be something stronger, or it could be something like a declaration of conflict of interest, of interests. Every observer will have to say whether or not they have fossil fuel interest, money or board members, etc. So there's a range of outcomes, but I think the important thing here is that this is the first time this is officially on the agenda. This is the first time that the UNFCCC body is going to discuss this in an official way. It certainly was discussed last May, but this is the first time that the UNFCCC Secretariat and parties have agreed that this needs to be part of the conversation. And I think that's a historic moment, especially because for the last 22 years, we've been negotiating this treaty, and we've yet to arrive at the sort of aggressive and much needed solutions to get us there. And so we have to ask, what can we do differently? And we believe this is one of the things we need to address in order to move things more quickly.
Yeah, we agree, and I hope the UNFCCC itself and the countries see it as important as you're explaining right now. And then at the beginning, you mentioned a bit who was not seeing the conflict of interest, like Australia and so on. But right. I would like to ask which countries are supporting these, or which do you think are more aligned towards this cause?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of conversations happening right now. What I can tell you is that in Bonn in May, the LMDC bloc and the African group both stood up in support of a conflict of interest policy, of just having this discussion. And there's definitely support amongst other blocs that haven't voiced their support publicly. But a year ago at this meeting, those two groups, which represent about 70% of the world's population, supported this. So we're really hopeful that we'll be able to show even more support in the meetings coming up.
Yeah, we hope so. And that's something we hope to report from there. So trackers that will follow Climate Tracker at the COP, or even if you want to follow any of the social media of Corporate Accountability International, I hope to follow up what would happen this Tuesday, which maybe, I don't know, maybe because we are geeks of these things, but that may be really interesting. Right. So then I was trying to get also a broader perspective. So we know that essentially it's bad to get those people there, to get the fossil fuel industry lobbying for something against climate change. So how do you think this affects the global fight against climate change, that the fact that we have to reduce emissions and get to a global goal, etc.?
Well, I think the same concept applies. There's a reason why the world's biggest historical emitters have been, in many cases, the slowest to respond to this crisis. Our government in the US is completely entrenched, especially now, with fossil fuel industry interests. And the same goes for Australia, and the same goes for the European Union. And so if we're going to take this crisis seriously, like very seriously, and take the action we need to save people's lives, we need to be realistic about what we can accomplish when the world's most powerful industries, with the most money and the most money at stake, profits at stake, are helping to write the rules. And so our hope is that this won't end here. This is a conversation that every national government should be having, is how can we better address climate change by limiting the influence of those who stand to lose money, frankly. ExxonMobil will continue to put out public relations about their support for reasonable climate action, or that they support a carbon price, but that is not enough. And we can't be looking to the very industries that have gotten us in this mess to provide the solution. That's the role of government, and we need bold leaders who are gonna stand up against this influence. And certainly, recent political events have made that seem less likely. But while you have elections in the U.S. and in the U.K. That can be disheartening at times, you also have this leadership rising up from the global South that's demanding a conflict of interest policy at the UNFCCC. And we've seen this before. We saw at the World Health Organization's Global Tobacco Treaty, the global South finally stood up and said, we're going to withhold our consensus until you give us what we need. And it worked. And so we know it can be done again. And so this is a conversation that everyone should be having, and it can't stop at the UNFCCC, because as everyone knows, the treaty, it's the convention itself and the Paris Agreement. These are they need to be implemented at home. And so for this to truly have the impact it could and it needs to, governments need to take this up at home as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. And I think that resonates with some of the people that are watching us. So Boat from Uganda is saying, yeah, how can we further policies that cut fossil fuels in developing countries such as Uganda, which are particularly oil and like digging for oil still and looking for gas and all this. So maybe you have some ideas on how these conflict of interest things could be at the national level too.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that I would point to is the power of the public climate. People, I'm seeing it every day in the US right now in response to the Trump administration. People out in the streets can have a huge impact. Media coverage can have a huge impact. And so what everyone's doing in their home countries is a really, really important part of the process, because we run corporate campaigns. And so what we call this social climate, it's called denormalizing certain behaviors. You want to make it less normal for the fossil fuel industry to have influence over the government. You want to make politicians think twice before they take that meeting or they accept that contribution. The more we can make people, elected officials and decision makers accountable by denormalizing the industry's influence, the more accountable our government will be to us. And so that's part of what you all are doing. That's part of what we're doing is raising the visibility of this. So people start asking that question: why is the government having closed door meetings with X corporation? Why did that renewable energy target legislation disappear? Those are the questions we need to start asking and holding our elected officials accountable for. And certainly it's not a small feat, right? And it's different in every country. But one thing is true, I think, almost across the board, is that as long as there is a free or semi-free press, they are able to better hold our elected officials accountable. And so this is what we need to do. And so I'm out here trying to generate more of that media, and you all are the key to getting it, to getting this conversation to start happening at the national level, in order to move the dial on this issue just a little bit and bring power back to people.
Thank you, Jesse, and definitely we are here to write articles about it. So that's great. I have a question from someone else. I don't know where he or she is from, but that person says, what do you suggest is the best way to get your governments to listen to you regarding climate change and limiting greenhouse gas emissions? So maybe you have some experiences from what's going on now in the US or people you are working with right now.
There's a word and a hashtag that's popped up in the US that I'm sure has been used in other places, but it's resist. You know, at every turn, people in the US now are saying, no, it's not going to be like that. No, we need better policy. No, we need protections for these people. As the Trump administration tries to roll back every environmental policy it can, people within the government themselves are protesting. And so it's about civil disobedience. It's about getting visibility on the issue and not taking no for an answer. And obviously the context here is different than it is in other places. So obviously it really depends on what is possible, given the structure of government. But the best way to get government to listen is to generate people power. And I think one of the great tools that we have at our disposal that many generations didn't before us is is the internet. There's only so much governments can do to limit us organizing each other and getting our opinions out there on social media and on news sites, and it can have a really big impact on public opinion. It can draw other people into the movement, and it can move policymakers.
Yeah, we hope so, and I hope it works in the US as well due to the situation. Some tracker from Germany was asking that, actually, was saying, how do you see, now going a bit back to the UNFCCC, the role of the US in all this conflict of interest thing?
Well, we know they didn't support it, and they opposed it under the Obama administration. So assuming that they have their affairs in order, which I'll come back to, we expect them to not support this policy, which is not a surprise, and we're prepared for that. But the other question is, do they have their affairs in order? It's not even clear right now what this delegation looks like, who's leading the U.S. climate change, who the next envoy is. And so there's a potential that we, as a global community, have an opportunity here to advance to implement the Paris Agreement in the strongest way possible, to advance a strong conflict of interest policy, get the things done that those suffering the worst effects of climate change need right now, while obstructors like the US are sort of in this chaotic moment. We don't even know if the US is going to stay in the Paris Agreement. The Trump administration has failed to even arrive at that decision. So while they are dragging their heels and failing to develop a game plan, the global community has an opportunity to step up and move some really powerful things forward. That's our hope. I think waiting around for the U.S. to figure out what it's going to do would be a mistake. The crisis demands that we take urgent action, and it's also the opportunity demands it as well. With the U.S. out of the picture, there's potential that we can get a lot of very important and impactful things done.
Awesome, and I hope it begins in Bonn.
Yeah.
So I don't have any more questions from the audience, although we have Rizan saying thank you for the webinar, which is great. I wanted to ask you, Jesse, if you wanted to make any final points which I maybe forgot to ask or which you think are important.
I think we pretty well covered it. I guess the one thing I will say is that there are numerous other numerous other bingo groups that are pretty well known that we did not cover in this report, but that deserve a certain amount of scrutiny themselves. So groups like Business Europe, groups like the World Coal Association, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which has been a leading climate denial think tank in the US for decades. They used to advocate on behalf of the tobacco industry when the public health movement was trying to get better regulation in the US. And so they just pick the biggest abusers and they come and jump in on their side. There are a number of abusive and abusive organizations that represent the interests of the fossil fuel industry and others outside of the list that we covered. So if anyone has any questions about that, I'm happy to send the information that I have. If you come across a bingo group that's based in your region of the world that you want more information on, I'd love to try to help. Let's not end this study just on these 6, because while they are worth discussing, there are plenty more that are also part of this larger group of fossil fuel representatives at the UN talks.
Yeah, so you heard that. If you have a business group that you know is attending the UCCC, or that you suspect it does or it influences your government, you can get in touch with us and maybe we'll find out more things about them. And yeah, I think that gives us a bit of inspiration on what to write our articles about. I will make sure that I attach the link to this report in the link, in the link below this webinar, so you don't have to search too much to find it. And otherwise, we will really keep you updated on how this is going, because it is really interesting when we are all in Bonn for this intersession. So thanks again, Jesse, for being here. It's great to have updates on what the fossil fuel industry is doing for now, but we won't let them do it forever. And yeah, see you soon in Bonn, I guess.
Yeah, can't wait. See you in a week.
Okay, thanks you so much.
All right.
And thanks for this nice webinar. Goodbye.
Goodbye.